So we kind of went through this background already. I am a Progress Ninja specifically for Fiddler. So recognized recently for contributions to Fiddler, just community involvement with it. I have my Twitter, my email, and my blog information. And I do have at the end, I have a link to the slides and the code. There's not a lot of code for it, but if you want to be able to see the exact same things we go through the talk, that will be available at the end. So where do you start with Fiddler? So Fiddler is meant for HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And I gave you two links to the actual RFC here. I think it's useful to read these documents at times. So for instance, specifically things like caching, where I want to understand exactly what are the rules that are supposed to be followed for caching. I can't guarantee that every browser and device is going to follow all of the rules, but I have actually had to refer to these specs to be able to see how should things behave. I put the HTTP2 in italics. It is available. I use it in production. I only put it in italics to let you know that Fiddler currently does not support HTTP2. So if you actually open up Fiddler, it will fall back to use HTTP 1.1. So I've actually seen people that have had problems specifically with HTTP2, and so they were troubleshooting it, and you hear this often. I open up Fiddler and then everything works, right? And they don't know why. And obviously you can't leave Fiddler open forever on your production site, and your customers aren't going to use that. So I just wanted to warn you, it doesn't support HTTP2. HTTP is a request and a response pair time that we'll see throughout the talk. So you'll get to see each request has a header and a body, and the same thing for the response. So what is Fiddler? Fiddler is a tracing tool that was built specifically for HTTP. So Eric Lawrence worked at Microsoft. He does again, but he was on the clip art team. People would order clip art years ago, and they would try to download it, and something wouldn't work. And so they would call up Eric's team and say, we have this problem. We don't know what's going on with it. Back then, probably the best tool for troubleshooting was Microsoft's Netmon. It's very similar to a Wireshark today, where you're literally seeing every packet and every frame on the network. And what it turned out that Eric said that wasn't very good to troubleshoot for people that aren't really technical. What they wanted the ability to see a full request and a response. So Eric didn't know C#, he didn't know HTTP, he didn't know .NET was just coming out, and he decided he's going to learn all that stuff and write Fiddler on the weekends, basically, as a side gig. So I think that's pretty cool. It was acquired by Telerik in 2012, which it was then bought by Progress. It is free still, so I gave you a link where you can download it. There's actually two versions now. Fiddler Everywhere just came out, so they are rewriting Fiddler to run cross-platform. So it will run Windows, Mac, and Linux. Fiddler Classic, which most of you are probably familiar with, only works on Windows. So the good news is Fiddler Everywhere, they're improving the user interface. They're making it good for sharing. I'm going to show it briefly at the end if I can. It doesn't have all of the features yet. They continue to add features to it. So I'm going to focus on Fiddler Classic today and show you these techniques because the advanced techniques aren't yet built into Fiddler Everywhere, and I'll kind of break that out at the end. And a lot of people have used Fiddler. The point of this talk is a lot of people use it like it's dev tools, right? They're doing simple tracing, looking at request responses. There's a lot more that Fiddler can do, and that's what we're going to focus on during this talk. So the first thing to know about Fiddler is how does it actually work? So I talked about Wireshark. Wireshark is actually looking at my network interface. So it's either looking at my Ethernet or my Wi-Fi connection, and it's literally intercepting all of the traffic for all of the different protocols. That's not how Fiddler works. So Fiddler is actually, it's a separate app, and it runs as a proxy, which just means it's going to sit between my browser and my server. So when you start Fiddler up, it actually changes the system configuration to tell it anybody who wants to send HTTP and HTTPS traffic through a proxy, please route it to this address and port. So we'll take a look at what that looks like. So I've got a fictional travel page we'll look at throughout this talk. I started up Fiddler already. And so when I did that, if I go into settings and we go down to System and look at the proxy settings, you'll see it says use a proxy server, and it says please route traffic if you've seen 127.0.0.1 is my machine. So it's basically saying I want to route any HTTP, and if I were to go more to the right, HTTPS traffic, those two protocols are going to get routed to that IP address, which is my laptop, and port 8888, which is the default port for Fiddler. So modern browsers just know this. When you start up Fiddler, it tells, in my case, Windows, please route traffic this way. Modern browsers know how to use a proxy, so now all of my traffic will actually go through. And the reason that'll be important, we'll talk a little bit later about people will start up Fiddler and they don't understand why they don't see traffic. It's because it's a proxy. So if your client is not supporting a proxy, and I'll show you a couple ways to set it later, that's probably why you're not seeing traffic. So just be aware that that's how Fiddler is going to work. We'll talk about web sessions. I'm an ASP.NET developer, so when I think of a web session, I think of all of your requests for a given visit. The way that Eric chose to define it, a web session is a single request and response. So that's the terminology I'm going to stick through throughout this talk. We'll look at a few of the features here. So let me pop over to Fiddler. I'm just going to clear some of the stuff out. Let's go back to our travel page. I'm going to hit Control F5. We'll see the web sessions here on the left. And there's a lot of things that I can do. So for instance, if I came and saw this bootstrap, I can right click and mark it, say in orange. I work with a lot of third-party people. I work with my other developers. I work with my operations group. So it's not uncommon for me to get a Fiddler trace and need to send it to someone else. So by marking it, and I can even right click and say comment, I can say need a newer version. When I do all this stuff, when I send this to someone else, they can go look and see, okay, it's the orange ones you're concerned about, and then they can go look at the specific comments if they look at that session. So that's one thing I can do. I can also search. So when I look at this, we're my day job, we're an e-commerce site. We have a lot of content, a lot of requests. In this case, I might look and say, I'm not sure why I have this web font here, right? I don't remember including this myself. So where did this come from? So I could come up and say, I want to find sessions, and I can type in halflings. And we'll highlight that particular URL, but it still didn't tell me where it was being requested. So it took me quite a few years before I figured out I use compression for my website for performance. So all of this content, these CSS files, my JavaScript files are being compressed. By default, Fiddler does not look into compressed content. So I need to pick the decode compressed content. Now, if I do find sessions, again, it does what you'd expect. It tells me that got pulled in because of Bootstrap, which is handy to find things. So just be aware, again, when you do searching, most modern websites use compression, so you need to turn on that decode compressed content. Another way that I could find who requested this, I can actually say I want to select parent request, and it will actually know. Because Fiddler's a proxy, it's watching all of this traffic back and forth. It's able to identify that that was pulled in because of Bootstrap, which is handy. Another cool feature, I can hold down the Alt key. So if I pick any value here, like these JPEGs, if I hold down my Alt key and click on JPEG, it's going to find all of the other web sessions in this trace that have that same value. So it's just a nice way for me to identify, for instance, where are all of the CSS files, where are all the JavaScript files, any of these columns that I want to see the things that have the same value. Again, you just hold down the Alt key and you'll be able to see those. Next thing we'll talk about is decrypting HTTPS. So you should be using HTTPS for all of your websites today. I listed SSL here. It's no longer considered secure, but I just wanted to mention people misuse the term still. all that HTTPS is, it's the same HTTP protocol that we're used to, but it's now running over an encrypted connection. So in the past it was SSL, today it'll be TLS. Fiddler can be a person in the middle. And so if you think about it, the whole point of HTTPS is I want the communication between my browser and my server to be secured in a way that people can't view it. So it seems odd. Why is it that Fiddler would be able to intercept and see this traffic? That should be kind of concerning, right? So let's go look at what that would look like. I'm going to clear this out. I'm just going to go out to Bing, because that's using HTTPS. And if I come back into Fiddler, you'll see I can see a request. I can see a tunnel connection that was made to Bing, but I can't actually see any of the content. And that's what we want, right? That's the point of HTTPS. However, now that we use HTTPS, I still need to be able to troubleshoot my websites. So I'm going to come in, you can say Tools, Options, go to HTTPS. You can say I want to decrypt the HTTPS traffic. I've already done this on this machine. If you have not done this before, the way that Fiddler is going to work is Fiddler is going to try to act as a certificate authority. So if you're familiar with how HTTPS works, as a web service provider, I'm going to create a public-private key. I'm going to send my public key to a certificate authority like Let's Encrypt, for instance. They will prove that I own that domain, and then they will digitally sign that and give me back that certificate. So what Fiddler does to do this decryption is it says it's going to act like it's a certificate authority. So as soon as I say this, the first time you do this on your machine, it will come up and say, do you want to trust the Fiddler root certificate? And it'll ask you this about 5 times. It'll say, are you sure? Are you sure you want to do this? So what you're agreeing to is you're saying, any certificates that are signed by Fiddler, I'm going to trust. Normally, browsers know about the well-known certificate authorities like Let's Encrypt, etc. I'm then saying, please trust the one from Fiddler. So if I hit OK here, I'm going to clear this. And let's go back, and I may have to restart my Fiddler. We'll see if it makes me do that. So let's try that. Now you can see I'm getting the normal trace that I did before. If I come and look at the inspectors, I'm actually able to see all of the content. So it's not breaking HTTPS. It's not done any sort of crack or anything. It's just because I trusted Fiddler's root certificate, Fiddler generated a fake certificate saying it was Bing.com. My browser believes it because it trusts that certificate. It encrypts it. That way Fiddler can decrypt it. Fiddler goes out to the real Bing website, gets the actual server certificate, re-encrypts it on the wire. So it's safe from end to end, but Fiddler is able to intercept and do that decryption. So it's necessary today because most of us are using sites that use HTTPS and we need to be able to troubleshoot. Next thing we'll look at is filters. So filters allow me to do some basic things to request. So I'm going to say, let's turn some filters on. And you can see that I can hide stuff from particular places. I could choose and say, I only want to see traffic from one instance of a browser. I can also manipulate requests. So let me close this out. I'm going to clear this. I'm going to go back and re-request the travel page again. Hit Control F5. So one of the things I can do, if you see here, if I look at Bootstrap, I talked about the fact that I use compression. And so if I go to the transformer, you can see that this is compressed content. With filters, I can actually modify things. So if I said delete a request header, browsers send a request or an accept encoding that tells the server that they handle compression. If I turn this on and say, please delete that, if I come back and hit Control F5 again and go back into Fiddler, you'll see up here, this was about 27K. Now it's 122K. And if you look at the inspector, you can see that it's not compressed. So that's just a simple example of not only can I hide things using filters. I can actually manipulate requests if I want to. There's a lot of other simple things I can do in here. I'll show you another one, blocking CSS files. So if I hit Control F5, this does what you'd expect. Why would I ever want to do this? Well, one of the more common performance techniques nowadays, if you're serious about performance, is inlining your critical CSS. So you could take a look at all of the CSS that's used by your site, and you can break it up into the stuff that's important for the main page display and everything else. The important stuff you can embed directly into your HTML page. So you take the critical CSS, you embed it into the HTML. The reason you do that is because then the browser does not need to wait for any other requests. As soon as it has the HTML response, it can instantly start to paint the page. And then in the background, it'll go get the rest of the CSS it needs. So it's nice that I can come in here and make sure that I'm doing things correctly. So I haven't tried to do that for this web page, but if I did, I'd be able to come back and test it. I could see that even though I'm blocking all the CSS files, the page basically paints okay. So that's something I could use that for. Another thing with GDPR, and in the United States, we have CCPA for privacy. It's important to know which responses are setting cookies. So I could say flag every response that sets a cookie. If I request the page again, anybody who sets a cookie then would be in italics. So it'd be a quick way for me to look through the list and I could see every vendor who's actually setting a cookie in a quick way. So again, that's filters. They're just a quick way to either hide stuff or make some modifications without having to do a lot of work in Fiddler. Another cool thing in Fiddler is the composer. So we're talking about things dev tools can't do. Well, this is something that's cool that you can do in Fiddler. You can actually intercept requests and make changes to them on the fly. So again, let's look at our travel page. I could construct these on the fly. I'm going to choose to drag and drop. So I'm going to take the request. I'm going to drag the bootstrap request over to Composer. And now what I've got what was requested. You can see all the headers here. I'm going to take off that accept encoding again manually. So I just take that off and I hit execute. And you can see now it's not compressed. So just a quick example of I can literally create anything I want. So there's a lot of times I'm doing security testing or other things. It's hard to make a browser do certain things, but it's easy to come in here and just manually create my own request. Another thing I could use this for, I've got a shopping site here. And let's say I want to test out and see if my web developers are coding this correctly. So I'm going to order one of these and they're $1,095. So I'm going to hit checkout. If I were to go back in here, I can drag this over to Composer, drop it here. Something you notice that's odd, the cost or the price is actually part of the post to the server. So that's kind of concerning. I don't really want the client sending a price to the server. So I want to see if it was developed correctly. I'm going to put $1 instead. And if I were to hit execute and go back and look at what that response looks like in the inspectors, I'm just going to pop this in Notepad here. And it says cost of $1 each, right? So again, something I wanted to test that my server-side development is done properly. So I was just trying to make sure that they coded it right, and they didn't. They're basically taking the price from the client. The Composer, again, is a quick way for me to modify the requests and see how my server is going to respond. If you've done curl before, curl is just a quick way to make web requests. So let's go back into our Composer here. I get sent these sometimes from security people, pen testers and stuff. They tend to like to use curl, and they'll send to me and say, if you do curl, do this request, you'll see what's wrong. I looked for a long time to find a good, safe Windows curl client, and I didn't have a lot of luck. I didn't realize that in Composer, under the scratch pad, you can actually run curl commands. So if I run that curl, and we look at that request, you'll see the user agent is curl Fiddler. So again, if you do curl, just be aware there's a built-in curl client within the Composer tab under the Scratchpad. Another cool feature is breakpoints. So I'm going to clear this out again. There's a quick exec command line area down here. So I'm going to type BPU, which just says I want to set a breakpoint. Because Fiddler is a proxy, it's sitting between my browser and server. So I'm saying anytime somebody goes for bootstrap min.css, I want you to break and let me see it before you send it to the server. So I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to go back and run that again. So let me pull up the travel page. I'll hit Control F5. The thing you'll notice, Fiddler starts to glow. And if I go there, you'll see it's sitting waiting. So it saw the request for Bootstrap, but it hasn't sent it to the server yet. Now I can come in here and just make modifications. So if I want to change this, I'm just going to put this in raw mode here. I can actually just change and take off that accept encoding again, just to keep that example going. I can say run to completion. And you can see it came back and it wasn't compressed again. So just the ability to get in between and let your client do whatever the client wants to do. Don't have to change that code, but you can intercept all of this within Fiddler and make changes. So I'm going to type BPU and delete the rest just to take that breakpoint off. So that was on the way to the server. I can also set breakpoints on the way back. So I'm going to set BPA after site.css, hit enter. Now what it's going to do is it's going to send all the requests to the server. The server is going to do what it wants to do. When it comes back, I want to do a breakpoint. So in this case, you see Fiddler glowing again. Here's my site CSS. I'll take compression off. I'm just going to change this color here. If I scroll down, we'll see it. I'm going to make this red. I'm going to say run to completion. So that went to the server, got the CSS file, came back. I changed it on the fly to be red. And if we go back and look at our client, you can see that it's now red on the client. So I've actually used this before. I've had issues with some of my combined CSS. I didn't want to go through the whole build deploy process just to see what was wrong. So I basically set this breakpoint up and I intercepted stuff on the fly, and I could just make changes to the CSS. It's really helpful with third-party content too, right? I can't change the vendor's stuff on their server, but I can intercept in Fiddler and make whatever changes I want to make. So I'm going to type BP after here and take that off as well. So breakpoints are another nice feature available in Fiddler. Another one is autoresponder. So because Fiddler's a proxy, I can actually have Fiddler return requests without ever going to the web server. And you can read about this when you get the slides. There's a bunch of different rules that I can set up. So let's take a look at what this might look like. I'm going to request the page again. I'm going to drag Bootstrap over to the autoresponder. And in this case, what I want to do, if you look at the drop-down, I can make anytime a request comes in for that specific file, and here's where that exact match is. I can do regular expressions, whatever I want. I'm going to say I want to intentionally make that slow. So you can go in DevTools and say, make DevTools, make the network look like it's slow 3G, whatever you want, but that's every request. I just want to see in this case, what if I had a third-party CSS file that was slow? So let me hit save here. And if I go back and make the request again, you'll see that I'm spinning here. In a second, the page goes blank. This is what my customer sees, right? That's what I wanted to find out. I wanted to see if CSS on my CDN was slow. What impact will that have on my customers? This is the impact. So again, that might be a good example of if I inlined the critical CSS, this stuff up here, even with a gray background, at least I'd be giving the customer feedback that something is happening, right? And again, that would be hard to test. It would be hard to simulate one particular file or one particular vendor being slow. That's something you can do with autoresponder. And again, I can do all sorts of other stuff. So I've used this in production. Anytime I got a new third-party vendor, if I wanted to make sure that if they were not available, say, that it didn't impact my site, I could just come in and say I want to return a 500 error or a 404. I could go back and retest my site and it would say, hey, without this vendor there, does that impact the rendering? Does it make things slow? Does it make things die? So that's a cool feature of being able to use autoresponder. Once you get used to using Fiddler Everywhere, it's great. We're a responsive website, so we work on phones, tablets, desktops, etc. So I get used to using Fiddler all the time, but then I have somebody come and say, I have an iPhone and it's not working right. So how do you do that? Well, even with Fiddler Everywhere, I'm not going to be running Fiddler Everywhere on an iPhone. So what I can do is, because Fiddler is a proxy, I can actually go and set the proxy settings of my phone to point at, in my case, I'm running Fiddler here on a Windows laptop. I can get the IP address of my laptop, and then I can go add that into my iPhone. So first, let's look in Fiddler here. I'm going to clear that out. If you go to Tools, Options, Connections, you see this allow remote computers to connect. So I'm allowing other computers to come to my IP address, port 8888, and then I can see their traffic. So I'm not going to try to set it up here. I've saved this off. On an iPhone, it's not quite where you would expect it to be. If you go into your Wi-Fi settings and you scroll to the bottom, there's a place where you can manually set a proxy. So this is the IP address when I did the trace of my laptop, port 8888. And once I set that, now if I go back into my iPhone, you can see I can pull up the site like what we would see. But if I were to open up that trace, I can go look at the inspectors and I can see that it's seeing an iPhone. So again, I have all the capabilities, the autoresponder, the composer, anything I want to use Fiddler, decrypting HTTPS, all of that stuff will work as long as I go tell my iPhone to route its traffic through Fiddler. Because Fiddler is a proxy, I can do that. I do this also if I have to troubleshoot on someone's machine. You've probably had this. Somebody in the office is having a problem. If I walk over and install Fiddler on their machine, about 3 weeks from now, their printer's going to stop working for some reason, and I'm going to get blamed, right? So if I'm troubleshooting other people's machines, I often will not put Fiddler on their machine. I'll actually go into their browser settings and manually set their proxy to point to my machine, just like I did for the iPhone. That way I can trace all of the traffic on my own machine, not install anything on their machine, and still use Fiddler as I would expect. Most clients, you can set a proxy pretty easily. If it turns out you can't, you can look at Telerik, has some documentation on reverse proxying. So that's a way that you can set that up if you're not able to set a proxy on your client. But it's nice because, again, I can trace all of these devices. So let's look at some common issues. If I want to, I can limit Fiddler traffic to a certain browser. So if I were to pick this and drag and drop it on a browser, it will only capture traffic for that particular browser instance. So that's handy. But sometimes if you do that, you might find out that later on, and Eric has had this, people have sent to him and said, tracing doesn't work anymore. Well, it turns out they closed that browser instance and opened up a different one, and they're still limiting it down to the old browser instance. So if you do that technique, you just got to remember to click here again to get any process. One that's more familiar to me, I'll do a trace, and as soon as I get what I want, I will click on this capturing. So now I can go analyze everything, but it's not adding more web sessions to the list, okay? But then I'll forget that, right? I'll turn around, I'll go try to do something else. I'm not seeing traffic again. So if you did that, just come down here and make sure that that says capturing. Another common thing is your client just doesn't use a proxy. So I'm an ASP.NET developer. I'm running, in my case, I'm running my IIS and ASP.NET on my own laptop. So when I do that, my ASP.NET pages often also call third-party web services, REST APIs, whatever. most people, when they do that, will say, well, I see the traffic from the browser to ASP.NET, but I don't see all these back-end calls. Why don't I see that stuff? Well, it turns out in .NET that .NET classes don't use proxy settings by default. So if you need to do that, you can go in a config setting. You can set it per call if you want. You can just set the proxy manually to point at the correct address and port. Or if you go into a config file, you can actually set and say, I want all of the .NET classes to proxy through this address. Then I'll get everything. I'll see the traffic from the client browser to ASP.NET, but I'll also see all the ASP.NET to the backend. So again, the main message is, if you have HTTP or HTTPS traffic and you're not seeing it in Fiddler for some reason, look at these things and figure out how to make sure that your client is actually using a proxy server. Next, we'll talk about Fiddler scripts. I showed you how to use filters and breakpoints. Sometimes I want to programmatically do that, so I can actually write it. They called it JScript.NET. It's kind of a JavaScript C# sort of hybrid, and I can go write code that will respond to things and change how they look or actually modify things. And there's a few events here that I've listed, so let's look what that looks like. So I'm going to say customize rules. So this just pulls up the Fiddler script, and I'm going to go down to the area where I've got this. I'm capturing after a response, and I'm just saying if the request, so this is JavaScript-ish, but also has some .NET objects. So if that session has a .jpeg, I want to make the color yellow. So I'm going to just save that. Let's go back and re-request this again. So if you see, I just modified how it looks in Fiddler. So sometimes I might want to hide it. In this case, I just made it yellow. I'm going to switch that back so we can actually read that. What I've done this for instead is I've had cases where I wanted to do third-party testing, and I wanted to make sure that if every third party I used on my website was not available, I wanted to see what would happen to my site. So rather than try to drag to autoresponder and block, all of these different vendors, I could actually just write code that says, if the host name, like this example down here, if the host name didn't equal my production domain names, and I could list them out, please block it or do a 404 or a 500 or whatever. So it was a nice way to programmatically block all of my third parties and see what it did to my site. So I can make sure I coded that stuff safely. There's also a lot of extensions. So you can come out and get these free add-ons. I'm going to focus on two of them. First is JavaScript formatter. So let me clear this out again. I will turn on the make JavaScript pretty. And if I were to go back and make this request again, so I use minified files in production. You can see I've got minified JavaScript files. By default, if you've seen those before, they're just one long stream of text. All the white space is gone, all the comments are gone. It's okay, and it's what I want in production because the size is smaller. But when I need to troubleshoot on the client, it's harder for me to step through the code. Now, it's true in DevTools that I can pretty print and get it back, or I can use source maps, things like that. But if those aren't available to me, turning this on, if I go look at this now, it's essentially unminified that code on the fly. So now if I were to go look in the client and go into DevTools, all of the JavaScript is no longer minified. So it's just easier when I know I have a specific problem to be able to go through and change that. Another cool one is image bloat. So I'm going to turn that on, and I will pull up a page here. Let me hit Control F5 here. I still have my delay on. So I'll take that off here in a minute. What this image bloat does, every time you take a picture, it embeds metadata into the JPEGs to say, here's your camera, here's the shutter speed, all that kind of stuff. Well, that doesn't help the client Like, it's not a visual thing. It just adds weight to your page for no reason. So if you look at these ones scrolling by, image bloat has determined 43% of my small images here are actually metadata. So I use a tool called JPEG Train. You can do it however you want to take that metadata out, because you're essentially wasting download bandwidth and slowing down your customers when it doesn't visually help them. They don't care what shutter speed I used, right? Or what camera I used when I'm on the web. So this image bloat is cool just because I can kind of pop through my page. And I thought I had done this on all my images, but I realized I missed my 3 that are in the header section here. So that's a cool extension. So let me go turn that back off. I'm going to go set my autoresponder so we're not slow anymore. So I talked about troubleshooting other people's machines. I had a very non-technical, like a senior vice president in marketing. She had problems with our site. I didn't want to, she was remote too, so I didn't want to try to install Fiddler and explain to her how to do all that stuff. So you can actually use a tool called Fiddler Cap. Once they install this, it's very simple for them. When you open it, it's just got a really small screen and it says, clear your cache, clear your cookies, decrypt HTTPS. There's a big start capture button. When they hit that, it opens a browser. They can surf around, do whatever they want. It's even got a screenshot button. So I know this has never happened to you, but occasionally I'll get feedback that the site didn't look right. Not really helpful. If they hit the screenshot, it'll take a picture of the screen and embed that screenshot directly into the capture file. They can then save the capture file and send it to me, and then I can open it up in Fiddler and it will look exactly like I traced it with Fiddler. So again, it's just easy for non-technical people to do troubleshooting when I need them to do that. Like I said, sometimes today I'll do the other technique I talked about. I'll just change their browser proxy setting. That's fine. But times where I have to have them clear cache and clear cookies and decrypt HTTPS, there's times where I really want to use Fiddler Cap because those things are much easier for them to do that way. Some miscellaneous things. So I can save response files. So I can come up here and say I need to have this jQuery file for another site, for instance. I can just say save response, save the body off, not the headers, and I'll have the actual jQuery file that then I could pick up and use in my other site. So that's helpful. I can also do screenshots. So let me clear this. I'm going to go back. Well, it's right up here. It's kind of obscure. So if I hit this and I go back to my browser, it's going to do a 5-second countdown. And it just did a simulated camera sound. So now if I were to come back, you can see that screenshot gets embedded directly into the trace. So again, while you're doing traces, if you want to be able to save what the screen looked like at that time, it's nice because I can do the screenshots. Now when I go do a file save this entire archive, that will be part of the archive. So when I send it to another developer or a third party, they're able to see what my screen looked like. I can encrypt my archives. So if I were to, if I do save all sessions, it's not completely obvious, but right here, if I pick password protected, so this is actually going to use AES encryption. So it's 128-bit. I can set it to 256, so it's solid encryption. I can then type my file name, and then it's going to ask me for a password. So when I type this, it's going to derive an AES key based on my password. Now I can have an encrypted session archive, so I can send that via email to a third party. Obviously, I'm not going to put the password in the same email. I may call them and say, here's the passphrase I used. There are sensitive things, especially when you're decrypting HTTPS. There might be login credentials, there might be credit cards. So by storing it encrypted, I'm able to send it around, and only people with the right password will be able to see things. I also have a text wizard. So I did a capture the flag competition recently, and they had some stuff that was encoded in base 64. So I could just paste things here, and then I can say I want to take them from base 64. I can do URL or hex encoding. I can compute hashes. So if you have simple things you see in a trace that you want to be able to decode and see how they look, just be aware that Text Wizard is available there. You can create your own inspectors. I won't show that too much in here. I can spoof out user agents. So I have used this. I can come in and choose a pre-built, or I can create a custom. So if you need to make the server think you're a different user agent than you really are, you can go put that in here, browse it, say in Edge, but you can be telling the server that you're an iPhone, for instance. Obviously, when it comes back, it's still going to end up in Edge. But if you do server-dependent code based on what the device is, you'd be able to see in Fiddler, did the server respond correctly? In other words, did it give me back iPhone-specific content if you have that kind of stuff? So just be aware that you can spoof that out. There is Fiddler Core. So they actually broke the basic Fiddler tracing out to core code. And you can take that core code and basically embed it into your own .NET app. So think of it as they broke Fiddler into Fiddler Core, which is kind of the headless functionality of Fiddler away from the user interface. So if you need to do that. If you like command line stuff, there is a quick exec at the very bottom of Fiddler. So down in this box, let me make some requests here. I can come down and say I want to see greater than 50,000 bytes. That will select all of the ones that are larger than that. I could say give me less than 5,000 bytes. I could say I want to select all of the CSS. I could look for certain status codes. I could type CLS, hit enter, and it actually clears. So if you like using the command line and you're comfortable with that and you want to use it within Fiddler, just be aware there's a lot of things that you can do down in this quick exec. You can also extend it. So I wrote some Fiddler script for myself where I often wanted to remove certain hosts. So I made up an RH. So let me pull up the page again. If I type RH, in this case, I'll just do localhost. I'm telling it every session in there that's from localhost, please clear just those. And in this case, it happens to be all of them, but that's an extension that I wrote using Fiddler script. Another cool thing is host remapping. So if you've been out to example.com, I have times where I need the browser to be convinced it's a different site, but point it somewhere else. So if I come into Fiddler and I go to Tools, Hosts, I can enable mapping. So here I'm saying if you go to example.com, I really want you to run against my own machine. So let me go back and save that. And now I pointed it here. So the browser still thinks it's here. So I've used this. We have third-party libraries that care that I'm on the production version of my website, but I need to troubleshoot a problem like that on my development machine. I can do that host remapping so that the browser's convinced it's on production, but it's actually pointed at my own machine. So I can do Visual Studio debugging or anything here much easier than I'd be able to do, obviously, in production. So that's a cool feature. So we'll talk about Fiddler Everywhere. And so again, Fiddler Everywhere is the big advantages of it. And right now they're on version 1.2. It's multi-platform, so it'll run on Windows, Linux, and Mac. It has an improved user interface. So they've done a lot of work to make the interface look a lot cleaner. And they've also built in a lot of collaboration. So I do share archives a lot with other developers or third parties. Now that's built into Fiddler directly. So I can take a session or a request and say, I want to share this, and I can put in an email address. It will send them a link to where they can get to the cloud-based archive storage. At this point, they're still missing extensions, Fiddler script, breakpoints, quick exec. So it continues to improve with every release, and they're adding more and more features. I would say right now, Fiddler Everywhere probably does 90% of what average developers want to be able to do. So you get all of these advantages. If it turns out something that we talked about in this talk where you say, I really need an extension or I need to do a breakpoint, that's where you should still be looking at Fiddler Classic. So let me just open up Fiddler Everywhere here quick. So I'm going to remove. So you can see I've got that recorded. It's a more streamlined user interface. I've got capturing here where I can turn that on and off. So if I were to go back, hit Control F5, I can see the request for example.com. I've got all the inspectors you're used to. I'm going to pull up my travel page again. Hit Control F5. I can actually go to Bootstrap and say I want to edit it in Composer. So it has the same Composer we saw before. So I could come in here and take off the accept encoding, just like I was doing earlier. If I'm done capturing again, I can turn off the capture. I can also add an autoresponder rule. So I can put in delays like you see here. Again, all the same sorts of things you saw for the basics I can do. I can comment, I can mark. So that's cool. I can also save off previous sessions. So I saved off a session I wanted to be able to compare. If you've ever tried to do this before, Fiddler Classic just wants one capture open at a time. So if you need to compare, you kind of had to work through some hoops for that. Now I can have the previous session and the current one up at the same time and just easily go back and forth to compare the two. I can also save off particular requests. So I saved off a request here, and now I can go straight into Composer and make changes to it. So historically, if I need to get back to some of this stuff. So again, really cool. A lot of nice features they keep adding. A couple of resources. So I'm a Pluralsight author. I have 2 Fiddler specific courses. The most recent one, the top one, is basically your website has a problem. You don't know why, and it walks through should you use Fiddler or should you use DevTools or both potentially, depending on what your problem is. So it talks about style issues, JavaScript, performance, whatever your problem happens to be. It will kind of guide you into the right tool to use to troubleshoot that. I also have a more detailed course on Fiddler specifically that shows you how do you write extensions, how do you write custom inspectors, all that more detailed stuff you can find in that one. Also, Eric has a good book that I reference at the bottom. So that's for Fiddler Classic. I've read it probably 10 times. The host remapping would be a good example. I read through the book. I heard about it. I thought, that's interesting. Why would I ever do that? It was probably within the last year that I really needed to troubleshoot and act like I was production, and I couldn't figure out how to do it. And I said, oh, that's right, there's this remapping. So I went back and found it again in the book. So I just read it periodically because it's amazing how many things are hidden within Fiddler that are cool techniques that I just didn't need, that I didn't know that I needed. And then when I did, I was able to find out how to use them. So that's a good book. I've got my Twitter, my email, and my blog, and that's a link to where you can find the slides and the code. So that is all that I had at this point.